You've entered void of rules, a realm where normal constraints cease to exist. But beware, traveller, there is one rule here. You've got to hit subscribe. Seriously, it's the only rule we have. We just reached 1,000 brave souls, and we're hunting for 9,000 more to complete our dark ritual. I mean, reach our next goal, so subscribe. Or don't. But remember, the void remembers those who defy the only rule. Now let's get into today's video. I wasn't always a killer. Not for the government, at least. But when they came knocking at my door in Baltimore with an envelope and a voice that didn't match the man speaking it, I said yes. They didn't give me a badge. They didn't offer a pension. Just cash, names and places to be at very specific times. My name is Nathan Rourke, and for 5 years I did what they told me. Assassinations, cleanup work, and a few retrievals involving things you don't find in textbooks or even fringe forums, all under the umbrella of an unnamed branch that operates somewhere between Homeland Security and the Department of Things Best Left Alone. The work came easy to me. Maybe too easy. I'd grown up in foster care, bounced between homes where love was rationed and violence was currency. My father had been a drifter who left when I was 3. My mother overdosed when I was 8. After that, it was a parade of temporary families who saw me as either cheap labour or a monthly cheque from the state. The Hendersons kept me for 2 years in a farmhouse outside Frederick. They worked me like a hired hand, waking me at 4 in the morning to feed livestock and mend fences before school. Mrs. Henderson had a tendency to lock the refrigerator when she thought I was eating too much, which was most of the time. Mr. Henderson never hit me, but he had a way of standing too close when he was angry, letting his size and the smell of bourbon make his point. The Kowalskis came next. 3 months in a cramped row house in East Baltimore, where I shared a basement room with their actual son, Tommy, who stole my clothes and blamed me when his parents found his marijuana stash. Mrs. Kowalski cried a lot and asked why I couldn't be more grateful for their generosity. Mr. Kowalski worked double shifts at the steel mill and came home angry at the world most nights. After the Kowalskis, there were the Garcias, then the Williamses, then a string of temporary placements that blurred together in a haze of unfamiliar beds and houses that never felt like home. By the time I aged out of the system at 18, I'd learned that survival meant keeping your head down, your mouth shut, and your expectations low. The military gave me purpose for a while. 2 tours in Afghanistan taught me that killing could be clean, professional, even necessary. I was good at it in ways that scared some of my fellow soldiers, but impressed my commanding officers. I could stay calm under fire, make difficult shots under pressure, and compartmentalize the emotional aftermath in ways that kept me functional when others broke down. But civilian life felt hollow afterward. The transition from military precision to civilian chaos left me adrift in a world where nothing seemed to matter as much as it should. I tried construction work, hauling rebar and mixing concrete for 12 hours a day until my back gave out. I tried bartending at a dive near the harbour, listening to drunks complain about their problems while I served them the liquid solutions they thought they needed. Nothing stuck. Every job felt temporary. Every paycheck felt like charity. And every night felt like another step toward a future I couldn't envision. I was 26 years old and felt like I was already dead, just waiting for my body to catch up with the news. When the men in expensive suits found me working security at a Baltimore warehouse, drinking myself to sleep most nights in a studio apartment that smelled like mildew and defeat, their offer felt like salvation. They never told me their real names. The contact was always a different face, different voice, but the same dead eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. They'd approach me in neutral locations. Diners with cracked vinyl booths and coffee that tasted like burnt water. park benches overlooking the harbour, where joggers and dog walkers provided natural cover for clandestine meetings. Once, memorably, in the reptile house at the National Aquarium, standing in front of a display of gaboon vipers while tourists with cameras walked past obliviously. The conversation was always the same, brief pleasantries about the weather or current events, then a manila folder slid across the table or handed off during what looked like an accidental bump. Inside would be a photograph, an address, sometimes a few lines about the target's habits or schedule. Nothing more. No background, no justification, no moral framework to help me sleep at night. The money always came first. Cash in brown paper bags, enough to keep me comfortable and unquestioning. I rented a better apartment in Federal Hill, bought decent clothes, ate at restaurants instead of gas stations. For the first time since childhood, I felt like I belonged somewhere, even if that somewhere was the shadow world of government-sanctioned violence. My partner was Deacon Shaw, ex-priest turned blunt instrument, 6'4" with hands that could palm a basketball or crush a windpipe with equal ease. Quiet in the way that mountains are quiet, not empty, but full of potential energy, waiting for the right moment to move. He had the kind of stillness that made people nervous, like they were standing next to a loaded weapon with the safety off. Deacon always carried a leather-bound missal, worn smooth at the edges from constant handling. The pages were yellow with age and marked with handwritten notes in the margins. He read from it during downtime between jobs, lips moving silently as he worked through passages in Latin and English. Sometimes he'd pause to write something in a small notebook. He kept in his jacket pocket, cross-referencing verses and searching for connections I couldn't understand. He'd been recruited 3 years before me. They found him at a soup kitchen in Detroit, serving meals to the homeless while nursing bruised knuckles from bar fights. The combination of violence and charity had apparently impressed the same handlers who would later recruit me. A man who could hurt people but still cared about feeding the hungry was exactly the kind of contradiction they were looking for. The church had expelled him after something went wrong during confession. He never gave me the full story, just fragments dropped during long drives, between jobs when the silence became too heavy to bear. Something spoke Latin from behind the screen, he told me during our second assignment together. We were driving through rural Pennsylvania, heading to eliminate an arms dealer who'd been selling military-grade weapons to domestic terrorist groups. The highway stretched empty ahead of us, and the radio played nothing but static and distant talk shows. Old Latin, the kind they stopped teaching centuries ago, ecclesiastical pronunciation that died out with the medieval church. The admission hung between us like smoke from an unwelcome cigarette. Deacon wasn't given to flights of fancy or elaborate lies. He was practical, methodical, grounded in the physical world, in ways that made him an excellent partner for dangerous work. If he said something impossible had happened, then impossible things were possible in his world, and by extension, in mine. "What did you do?" I asked. I tried to investigate, spent 3 hours going through the confessional booth with a flashlight, looking for hidden speakers or recording equipment, some kind of practical joke by the altar boys maybe, or a test from the bishop to see how I'd react to unusual circumstances. He paused to light a cigarette, hands steady despite the story he was telling. But there was nothing there. No technology, no evidence of human presence. Just an empty booth with scratches in the wood that I'd never noticed before. Scratches that looked deliberate, like someone had been carving words with their fingernails. Could you read them? That was the problem. They weren't in any language I recognized, but they felt familiar anyway. Like I should know what they said, like the meaning was right on the tip of my tongue, but I couldn't quite grasp it. The conversation ended there, but it started something between us. A recognition that the world we'd been recruited into operated according to rules we hadn't been taught in any classroom or training manual. Our handlers never briefed us on the supernatural aspects of our work, but They didn't seem surprised when we reported encounters that couldn't be explained by conventional means. We didn't talk about faith after that conversation. Not directly anyway, but I noticed that Deacon started reading his missal more urgently after difficult jobs, like he was searching for specific answers instead of general comfort. He'd cross-reference passages with notes he made in his separate notebook, comparing different translations and looking for meanings that weren't immediately obvious to casual readers. Our assignments grew even stranger over time. What started as straightforward eliminations, corrupt officials, rogue intelligence assets, criminals who'd made the wrong enemies, gradually evolved into something more specialized. We'd be sent after targets who lived in places that didn't appear on official maps, or who had abilities that shouldn't have existed, according to established science. There was the woman in Savannah who could make people forget their own names just by looking at them. We found her in a boarding house near the waterfront, surrounded by dozens of residents who couldn't remember who they were or why they'd come there. She tried her trick on me when we cornered her in the parlour, but Deacon put a knife between her shoulder blades before whatever she was doing could take effect. The man in Portland who aged backwards whenever he killed someone. We tracked him through a series of nursing home and murders, watching security footage that showed a 90-year-old man entering the facilities and a 60-year-old man leaving them. When we finally cornered him, he looked like he was in his 40s but moved with the careful deliberation of someone much older. The twins in New Orleans who could share physical sensations across any distance. Hurting one would cause the other to scream, no matter how far apart they were. We had to take them simultaneously, coordinating our attack through radio contact while positioned on opposite sides of the city. Even then, the surviving twins seemed to feel his brother's death for several minutes before his own body gave up. Each job taught us something new about the hidden world our government apparently knew existed. A world where natural laws were more like suggestions, where human beings could develop capabilities that shouldn't be possible, where the line between science and supernatural was much blurrier than most people realized. But none of those assignments prepared us for what happened in San Angelo. San Angelo had been listed as a retrieval, some artifact that had gone missing from a private collection in Texas. The collector, an oil executive named Garrison Webb, had paid our handlers well to get it back quietly. No questions asked, no police involvement, just professional recovery and discreet return to its rightful owner. Webb owned half the mineral rights in 3 counties and had the kind of political connections that made problems disappear. He collected antiquities as a hobby, specializing in religious artifacts from extinct civilizations. His collection was housed in a climate-controlled warehouse outside the city, guarded by private security and protected by insurance policies worth more than most people would see in a lifetime. The theft had been an inside job. One of Webb's own security guards, a man named Rodriguez, who'd worked for the company for 8 years without incident, had somehow bypassed multiple layers of protection to steal a single item from the collection. Security footage showed him entering the warehouse alone on a Tuesday night, staying inside for less than 10 minutes, then leaving with a package wrapped in black cloth. Rodriguez had disappeared immediately afterward. His apartment was empty, his bank accounts closed, his family claiming they hadn't heard from him in weeks. The only lead was a tip from one of his former co-workers who thought he'd seen Rodriguez's car parked outside a house in the suburbs 3 days after the theft. We arrived in San Angelo on a Thursday afternoon, driving a rented sedan through neighborhoods of ranch-style houses and manicured lawns. The address we'd been given led to a modest 2-story home on a dead-end street, distinguished from its neighbors only by the overgrown yard and the newspapers piling up on the front porch. The house looked abandoned from the outside, but there were fresh tire tracks in the driveway and recent footprints in the dirt leading to the back door. Someone had been there recently, even if they weren't there now. We waited until after dark to make our approach. Standard procedure for residential operations. Less chance of witnesses, better cover for extraction if things went sideways. The back door was unlocked, which should have been our first warning that something was seriously wrong. Inside, the house was empty of furniture, but not of people. We found Rodriguez in the basement, along with 16 other individuals, arranged in a perfect circle on the concrete floor. All of them were dead, but that they'd been positioned with care. Hands reaching towards the center of the circle, faces turned upward as if they were looking at something wonderful, just out of sight. The missing artifact was obvious from the empty space in the center of the circle. Something round, maybe the size of a dinner plate, judging by the clean spot on the otherwise dusty floor. Whatever it was, 17 people had died to activate it, and someone had taken it when the ritual was complete. The smell in that basement was unlike anything I'd encountered before, or since. Not the usual odors of death, decay, bodily functions, the metallic scent of blood, but something else entirely. Something that made the air feel thick and hard to breathe, like the atmosphere itself had been changed by whatever had happened there. Deacon stood in that basement for 20 minutes, just staring at the arrangement of bodies. His missal was closed in his hands, but I could see his lips moving in what might have been prayer or profanity. The silence stretched between us until it became uncomfortable, then beyond uncomfortable, into something that felt almost sacred. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight I'd never heard before. "They were calling something home," he said, and it answered. "What kind of something?" "The kind that doesn't belong in this world. The kind that needs human sacrifice to maintain a foothold in our reality." He gestured towards the empty space at the center of the circle. Webb's artifact wasn't just a collector's item. It was a key, a way to open doors that should stay closed. We called in the job as a loss, told our handlers the artifact was gone, and the trail was cold. They accepted the report without questions, which should have been our first warning that they knew more than they were telling us. In our line of work, failure usually resulted in extensive debriefing sessions and pressure to continue the investigation. The fact that they dropped the matter entirely suggested they'd gotten what they really wanted from the assignment. That night, back in our hotel room, Deacon started reading his missal differently. More urgently, like he was looking for specific passages instead of comfort. I'd catch him cross-referencing verses with notes he'd made in his separate notebook, comparing different translations and searching for meanings that weren't immediately obvious. "Looking for something specific?" I asked one evening. "Protection," he said without looking up from the book. "Or at least understanding. There are things in this world that don't follow the rules we were taught growing up. Things that were here before us and will be here after we're gone. The church used to know how to deal with them, but that knowledge got buried under politics and modernization." "And you think it's still in there?" I nodded towards the missal. "Some of it. Enough, maybe. The old prayers, the ones they don't teach in seminary anymore. The rituals they stopped performing because they were too dangerous or too effective." He finally looked up at me, and I saw something in his eyes I'd never seen before. Fear, but not the kind that comes from facing human opponents. This was deeper, more primal. The kind of fear that had kept our ancestors alive when things with teeth and claws hunted humans in the dark. San Angelo wasn't random, Nathan. We were sent there for a reason. Someone wanted us to see what happened in that basement. Wanted us to understand what we're really dealing with. You think our handlers are involved? I think our handlers are tools just like us. Useful pieces in a game being played by something much bigger and much older than any government agency. Our final mission came 3 months later, wrapped in wax paper with the smell of iron clinging to it. No documents, no briefing folder, no background research. Just a single name written in long looping cursive, Eliander Vale, and beneath it 3 words that should have sent us running. Terminate at any cost. I met my contact at a rest stop outside Richmond. Different face this time, younger than usual, nervous in ways that our handlers typically weren't. He kept checking his watch like he had somewhere more important to be, and his hands shook when he handed me the package. When I tried to ask questions about the target, he just shook his head and walked away without the usual small talk about weather or traffic. Inside the package was a photograph of a pale man with no hair and empty eyes, along with an address in West Virginia. No background information, no known associates, no criminal history. Just a name, a place, and instructions to kill whatever we found there. Cinder Glen. Population unknown. The name meant nothing to me, but it had an immediate effect on Deacon. We were sitting in my apartment, Chinese takeout growing cold between us, while he studied the photograph under the kitchen light. His reaction was subtle but unmistakable. A tightening around his eyes, a slight pause in his breathing, like he'd recognized something he'd hoped never to see again. "This is one of his," he said finally. "Whose?" Deacon set the photograph down and opened his missal to a page near the back. The text was in Latin, but he translated key passages into English in pencil between the lines. "Old gods are dead, Nathan. All of them died when the new world was born, when science and reason replaced faith and superstition. All except one. He adapted instead of dying, learned to work within the new paradigm instead of fighting against it." What kind of adaptation? He stopped demanding worship and started accepting employment. Instead of temples, he works through institutions. Instead of priests, he uses agents. Instead of sacrifices, he collects assets. Deacon's finger traced the Latin text as he spoke. He still answers the faithful, but the faithful don't survive the conversation long enough to regret making contact. They become something else instead. Empty vessels filled with purpose that serve something far greater than their original humanity. And Vale is one of these vessels. Is. The distinction doesn't matter anymore. What matters is that someone wants him terminated, and they're willing to pay our handlers enough money to make it worth the risk. I wanted more details, but something in Deacon's expression warned me off. Instead, we spent the evening cleaning our weapons and packing light. Whatever we were walking into, it wouldn't require extended surveillance or elaborate planning, just killing and leaving, or so we thought. The drive to West Virginia took 6 hours through increasingly empty countryside. Towns grew smaller and more spread out until we were passing through places that existed only as names on green highway signs. Millwood, population 847. Deer Creek, population 312. Places where a single gas station and a diner constituted the entire commercial district. The mountains pressed in from both sides, covered in trees so thick they blocked out most of the sky. Summer heat hung heavy in the air, but our car's air conditioning couldn't quite shake the chill that had settled between us. Deacon read from his missal while I drove, sometimes stopping to make notes in his margins. The radio picked up nothing but static and the occasional burst of evangelical preaching from distant stations. "Ever been to West Virginia before?" I asked during one of his reading breaks. "Once, different job, different target, but the same feeling." He gestured towards the mountains around us. "These old places remember things. They hold on to memories longer than they should." Cinder Glen didn't appear on our GPS. The device showed our location as somewhere in the middle of unmarked forest, despite the presence of a clearly maintained road beneath our tires. When I tried to input the address manually, the screen flickered and displayed an error message I'd never seen before. "Location not found in current reality." "That's new," I muttered, tapping the screen. "It's old," Deacon corrected. "Older than GPS, older than roads, older than the idea that every place should have a name and coordinates." The address led us to a dirt road that branched off the main highway with no warning signs or mile markers. The turn-off was so subtle I almost missed it. Just a gap in the trees that looked barely wide enough for a single vehicle. We drove for another hour through forest that seemed to grow darker with each mile, the canopy so thick overhead that we needed headlights, despite the afternoon sun. The road surface was strange, not quite dirt, not quite gravel, but something in between that crunched under our tyres in ways that didn't sound natural. Sometimes I'd catch glimpses of what looked like bone fragments mixed in with the regular stones, but every time I tried to focus on them, they'd turn out to be just ordinary rocks, worn smooth by weather and time. We crested a hill and saw the town spread out below us in a valley that shouldn't have existed, according to our topographical maps. The landscape was wrong, too flat, too circular, like someone had scooped out a perfect bowl from the mountainside and filled it with buildings that belonged to different decades. If you could call it a town. Most of the structures had collapsed or were leaning so far they looked ready to fall with the next strong wind. What had once been Main Street was now a strip of cracked asphalt with weeds growing through every gap. A few buildings still stood upright. A general store with boarded windows, what might have been a post office with a faded sign, and at the town centre a white church with a cracked steeple. We arrived at dusk, clouds low and heavy, with the promise of rain that never seemed to come. Road dust kicked up by our tyres hung in the still air like fog, and the silence was complete. No birds, no insects, no wind through the trees, just the sound of our footsteps on broken pavement and the distant creak of settling wood. Population unknown, I muttered, looking around at the empty streets. Population 0, Deacon corrected, has been for years, but that doesn't mean it's uninhabited. As we walked deeper into town, signs of recent occupation became obvious. Fresh boot prints in the mud, near what had been a gas station. Tyre tracks that couldn't have been more than a few days old. Cigarette butts that hadn't been weathered by rain. Someone had been here recently, and they hadn't bothered to hide their presence. The general store was more intact than most of the other buildings. Through gaps in the boarded windows, I could see shelves still lined with merchandise, canned goods, household supplies, items that should have been looted decades ago if the town had been truly abandoned. But everything was covered in dust so thick it looked like snow, and the prices on the visible tags were from the 1970s. The post office next door showed similar signs of preservation. Mail slots were still mounted on the wall outside, and through the front window I could see sorting bins filled with letters that would never be delivered. The postmark dates I could make out were all from the same week, in October 1978. Something happened here, I said, something sudden. Something invited, Deacon corrected. This wasn't a disaster or an accident. This was a transaction. The church sat in the middle of town like everything else had been built around it, which probably was exactly what had happened. Small communities often grew up around their places of worship, spreading outward in rings until economic reality or other forces scattered the population to the winds. This church was different from the surrounding decay. While the other buildings showed decades of neglect, the church looked maintained. Fresh white paint covered most of the exterior walls, though it was applied over wood that was clearly much older. The windows were intact, if dirty. Even the front steps had been swept recently. The steeple was cracked down one side, and crows had built nests in the gaps. But these weren't ordinary crows. They were too large, too still, and they watched us approach with intelligence that felt uncomfortably human. Dozens of black eyes tracked our movement without fear or curiosity, just patient observation. The bell still hung in the tower, swaying slightly despite the absence of any wind. It was old bronze, green with age, and inscribed with text I couldn't read from ground level. But even from a distance, something about those markings made my eyes water if I stared too long. Someone's been taking care of this place, I observed. Someone's been using it, Deacon corrected. His missal was tucked under his arm, ready to be consulted if needed, but not yet opened. Question is, for what? The front doors were heavy oak, warped by years of weather but still solid. They opened with a groan that echoed through the empty streets behind us, a sound that seemed to go on much longer than it should have. Inside, the church retained more of its original character than I'd expected. Wooden pews faced a simple altar topped with a brass cross. Stained glass windows on either side filtered the dying daylight into pools of coloured light on the floor. Reds and blues and golds that shifted and moved as clouds passed overhead. The air smelled of old wood and recent candle smoke, with an underlying scent I couldn't identify, but that made my sinuses burn. Someone had been here within the last day or two, fresh wax drippings. On the altar, recent footprints in the dust between the pews, the lingering warmth of human presence in a space that should have been cold and empty. And sitting in the front pew, his back to us, was Eliander Vale. He was exactly as he'd appeared in the photograph, but the image hadn't captured the full wrongness of his presence. Pale skin stretched tight over sharp bones, completely bald, wearing a thick black coat despite the summer heat outside. His stillness was absolute, no breathing that I could detect, no small movements that living people make unconsciously. But it was more than just physical stillness. There was something about his presence that made the air in the church feel thick and hard to breathe, like the atmosphere itself had been changed by whatever he'd become. "I've been waiting for you," he said without turning around. His voice had a calm, sandpaper quality that seemed to fill the entire space. Every word echoed off the walls in ways that shouldn't have been possible in such a small room, creating harmonics that made my bones vibrate in sympathy. He paused, and I could hear something that might have been laughter, or might have been something else entirely. They always send two, one with hands for killing and one with guilt behind his eyes. Another pause, longer this time. "Which are you, Mr. Rourke?" Neither of us had made introductions. We'd used assumed names at every hotel, paid cash for everything, taken precautions that should have made us impossible to identify. The fact that he knew my real name should have surprised me, but somehow it didn't. This whole job had felt wrong from the beginning, and Vale's knowledge just confirmed what I'd been suspecting. We weren't the hunters here. I raised my pistol, a .45 that had served me well on dozens of previous assignments. The weight felt familiar in my hands, a comfort in an increasingly uncomfortable situation. Deacon pulled his blade, a short, curved thing with a bone handle worn smooth by years of use. He'd never told me where he'd gotten it, but I'd seen what it could do to human flesh. Vale didn't flinch at the weapons. If anything, he seemed amused by our preparations, like children playing with toys they didn't understand. "You think you're servants of your country," he continued, still facing the altar. "Patriots doing necessary work in the shadows to keep ordinary citizens safe from extraordinary threats, protecting democracy and freedom and all the other noble concepts they taught you to value." The words hit closer to home than I wanted to admit. How many times had I justified what I did by telling myself it was for the greater good? How many targets had I eliminated based on nothing more than a photograph and the assurance that their death would make the world a safer place? But your acolytes just the same, obedient to a cause you don't fully understand, devoted to masters who hide their true intentions behind national security and plausible deniability. You kill who they tell you to kill, you retrieve what they tell you to retrieve, and you ask no questions because asking questions would mean admitting that you don't really know who you're working for or why. He shifted slightly in the pew, the first movement I'd seen him make since we'd entered the church. "The only difference between us is that I chose my master willingly, with full knowledge of the price. I knew what I was becoming when I accepted his gifts. I understood the transaction and agreed to the terms." There was something like pity in his voice when he continued. What they didn't tell you is that I died 7 years ago. Eliander Vale, human being, ceased to exist in this church on a Sunday morning in October. What you see now is only what remains of obedience, an empty vessel filled with purpose that serves something far greater than any earthly government. Vale turned slowly in the pew, moving with deliberate care like an old man with arthritic joints. When he faced us fully, I understood what he meant about dying. His eyes weren't glowing or obviously inhuman. They were just deeply, profoundly empty. Like looking through windows into a house where all the lights were on, but nobody had lived there for years. The sight triggered something primal in my brain, a warning system that had kept my ancestors alive when predators hunted humans in the dark. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get as far away from this thing as possible, but my feet felt rooted to the wooden floor. Vale's face was wrong in subtle ways that took me a moment to identify. His skin was too tight, stretched over bone structure that didn't quite match normal human proportions. His smile was too wide, revealing teeth that were too sharp, and arranged in patterns that hurt to contemplate. Even the way he breathed was off, too shallow, too infrequent, like his body was going through the motions of life without actually being alive. Deacon moved first. He'd always been the more aggressive of us, preferring close combat to gunfire when the situation allowed. The blade caught the coloured light from the windows as he rushed forward, aimed at the centre of Vale's chest where a normal human heart would be pumping blood. It was over in less than 3 seconds. Vale lifted one hand, almost casually, and touched Deacon's chest just below the collarbone. My partner stopped mid-stride like he'd hit an invisible wall. The momentum that should have driven the blade forward just disappeared. Deacon hung suspended for a moment, balanced on one foot, with his weapon raised, before he started to shake. The shaking started small, just a tremor in his hands, then spread through his entire body like he was having a seizure. But his eyes remained focused, aware, locked on Vale's face with an expression I'd never seen before. Wonder, maybe, or terror so complete it had transformed into something else entirely. Then he screamed, not in pain, but in something that sounded like religious ecstasy, like a man witnessing the face of God and finding it more beautiful and terrible than human minds were designed to process. The sound echoed off the church walls and seemed to go on forever, building in intensity until I wanted to cover my ears. The blade fell from Deacon's fingers and clattered on the wooden floor. The sound was shockingly loud in the aftermath of his scream, a sharp metallic note that seemed to hang in the air long after it should have faded. He dropped to his knees, but his eyes never left Vale's face. Tears streamed down his cheeks, and his whole body trembled with some overwhelming emotion I couldn't name. Then he started laughing, not the mad cackle of someone who'd snapped under pressure, but the deep, satisfied laughter of a man who'd finally heard the punchline to a cosmic joke. The sound was worse than the screaming because it suggested that whatever he was experiencing was worth the obvious cost. "It's beautiful, Nathan," he said, looking at me with an expression of pure joy. His voice was thick with tears, but there was no sadness in it. Only overwhelming gratitude and a kind of peace I'd never seen in him before. "You should see what he's showing me. You should see what's coming. It's going to change everything. It's going to make everything better." The words chilled me more than anything else that had happened in that church. Deacon wasn't being tortured or coerced. He was being converted, transformed into something that genuinely believed whatever Vale was offering was worth any price. Vale flicked his wrist, and Deacon's neck snapped with a sound like breaking kindling. The laughter stopped abruptly, but the expression of joy remained frozen on his face, even as his body crumpled to the floor. Whatever he'd seen in those final moments, he'd died believing it was wonderful. I fired 3 times before my partner's body had finished falling. Center mass shots that should have dropped any human target instantly. The .45 rounds hit Vale in the chest, throat and head with impacts I could see and hear. Blood soaked through his black coat, dark stains spreading across the fabric like spilled ink. But he didn't fall. He didn't even stagger. The wounds were real. I could see the torn flesh, smell the copper scent of spilled blood. But something was fundamentally wrong with the way his body responded to damage. Instead of pooling on the floor, the blood seemed to move with intention. Dark streams crept back toward the wounds like living things, drawn by some magnetic force I couldn't understand. Vale's body convulsed as if something inside him was rearranging itself to accommodate the injuries, redistributing vital functions to undamaged areas. His smile grew wider than human anatomy should have allowed. The expression stretched his face in ways that made my eyes water to witness, like looking at an optical illusion that your brain couldn't properly process. "You can't kill what's been baptized in his blood," he said. The words came out wrong, not quite matching the movement of his lips, like the voice was being produced by something other than normal vocal cords. "Death is just another country, Mr. Rourke. I've been a citizen there for 7 years. I emptied the rest of the clip. 15 rounds of hollow point ammunition, designed to cause maximum tissue damage and permanently stop any threat. Each shot found its mark, but each wound closed moments later. Vale advanced with measured steps, and shadows seemed to follow him across the floor. Not cast shadows from the failing light outside, but something else entirely. Living darkness that pooled around his feet and reached toward me, with tendrils that moved like fingers exploring the edges of reality. The wooden floorboards groaned under his weight, as if they were remembering footsteps that should never have walked there. The air in the church grew thick and hard to breathe. The stained glass windows began to rattle in their frames despite the complete absence of wind outside. Even the brass cross on the altar started to vibrate, producing a low, humming sound that seemed to resonate in my bones and make my teeth ache with sympathetic vibration. Temperature dropped 20 degrees in as many seconds. My breath came out in visible puffs, and frost began forming on the surfaces around me. The change was so sudden and dramatic that it felt like stepping into a walk-in freezer, but there was nothing mechanical about it. This was something else, something that changed the fundamental properties of the space we occupied. I ran. Not out of cowardice, though fear was certainly a factor, but because I finally understood what was happening. This wasn't an execution. It was a sacrifice. We hadn't been sent to eliminate Eliander Vale. We'd been sent to feed him, or whatever was living inside his empty shell. The government knew. They'd always known. The whole assignment had been arranged to bring us here, to this place, at this specific time. We were offerings, not operatives. Deacon's death hadn't been a failure of our mission. It had been the mission's success. I made it as far as the church doors before I heard Vale's voice behind me, calm and conversational despite the distance. "You can run, Mr. Rourke, but you can't leave. Not really. You've seen too much, been touched by too much. You're part of the transaction now, whether you want to be or not." I ignored him and kept running, bursting through the doors and into the evening air that felt like heaven after the oppressive atmosphere inside the church. But the relief was short-lived. The town around me had changed while we'd been inside. The empty buildings now showed signs of occupation. Lights flickered in windows that had been dark before. Smoke rose from chimneys in houses that should have been abandoned. And people moved through the streets, figures in dark clothing who walked with the same deliberate gait as Vale, their faces hidden in shadow. They didn't try to stop me, just watched as I ran past. Dozens of them standing in doorways and on porches, all perfectly still, except for their heads tracking my movement. Like spectators at a sporting event, politely observing but not interfering with the performance. I made it to the edge of town before the bell started ringing, a single deep toll that seemed to come from everywhere at once, not just the church tower behind me. The sound reverberated through my bones and made my teeth ache with sympathetic vibration. It was impossibly loud, like standing inside the bell itself while it was being struck. The sky above went black, not with approaching night or storm clouds, but with wings. Thousands of them, beating in perfect synchronization overhead. I couldn't see what they belonged to. The shapes were too large and moved too fast for my eyes to focus on. But I could feel their presence pressing down like a physical weight. The temperature dropped even further. My breath came out in thick clouds, and ice began forming on the ground around my feet. Something was coming through, using the church as a doorway between worlds. Something that brought winter with it wherever it went. The last thing I remembered was falling to my knees in the middle of the dirt road. A burning sensation spreading across my chest like someone was pressing a red-hot brand against my skin. The pain was so intense, it drove every other thought from my mind, so complete that it felt like my entire body was being rewritten from the inside out. Then, nothing. I woke up on a roadside 3 towns over with no memory of how I'd gotten there. No car, no weapons, just the clothes on my back and a mark on my skin that would never fully heal. The burn covered most of my chest, not random fire damage, but a deliberate pattern that looked almost like a handprint. 5 fingers and a palm pressed into my flesh with supernatural precision. A state trooper found me wandering along Highway 60 in a daze, dehydrated and suffering from exposure. Officer Williams was a decent man in his 50s who'd been working these rural routes for most of his career. He'd seen plenty of strange things in the mountains, but nothing quite like a man who'd apparently walked 20 miles through rough terrain without remembering how he'd gotten there. He drove me to Charleston General Hospital, where doctors treated me for heat exhaustion and asked questions I couldn't answer. Dr. Martinez, the attending physician, was particularly interested in the burn, which showed no signs of recent injury despite being obviously fresh. "Looks like a brand," she said, photographing it for my medical records. "But the skin healing is unlike anything I've seen. It's like your body is trying to preserve the mark instead of repair the damage." She ran tests for infection, took tissue samples for analysis, consulted with specialists in burn treatment and dermatology. Nothing explained how the mark had been made or why it was healing in such an unusual pattern. The tissue around the edges showed signs of supernatural preservation, as if my body's natural healing processes had been redirected to maintain the brand's clarity. I was released after 2 days of observation. The hospital social worker, a kind woman named Patricia Thompson, helped me contact my bank to replace my lost cards and identification. But when she called the number on file, she was told that no account existed under my name. Nathan Rourke had been erased from their system entirely. My apartment lease had been terminated for non-payment. My credit history wiped clean. My entire identity as a government asset simply deleted from all official records. The men in expensive suits who'd recruited me 5 years earlier had cut me loose without ceremony or explanation. Starting over with nothing but the clothes on my back, and the memories of what I'd seen in that church should have been devastating. Instead, it felt like a relief. For the first time in years, I was free to make my own choices instead of following orders from faceless handlers. No more manila folders. No more brown paper bags full of cash. No more killing people I'd never met for reasons I wasn't allowed to understand. But those memories wouldn't stay buried. 3 weeks after Cinder Glen, I was walking past St. Patrick's Cathedral in Richmond when I heard laughter coming from the bell tower. Not the innocent joy of children or the social chatter of a wedding party, but the same satisfied sound Deacon had made in his final moments. Deep, knowing laughter that spoke of secrets too large for human understanding. I stood on the sidewalk for an hour, listening to that sound drift down from the tower. Other pedestrians walked past without seeming to notice anything unusual. Cars drove by with their radios playing normal music. A group of tourists took pictures of the cathedral's facade, posing and smiling as if nothing was wrong. The world continued its regular rhythm, while something impossible laughed at jokes only it could understand. Finally, Father McKenna came out of the rectory to ask if I needed help. He was a young priest, probably fresh from seminary, with kind eyes and a genuine concern for strangers who lingered too long outside his church. The type of man who'd entered the priesthood because he actually believed in helping people, not because he was looking for power or prestige. "Is everything all right, son?" he asked. "Do you hear that?" I pointed toward the bell tower. He listened for a moment, head tilted attentively, like a bird trying to locate the source of a distant sound. "Hear what?" The laughter had stopped. Whatever had been up there was gone, or at least quiet. Father McKenna waited patiently for my answer, but I couldn't explain what I'd experienced without sounding completely insane. "Nothing," I said, "just thought I heard something." "Would you like to come inside? We have coffee in the parish hall, and I'd be happy to talk if something's troubling you." The offer was genuine, but I could feel the burn on my chest beginning to ache just from standing near the church entrance. Whatever had marked me in Cinder Glen didn't want me seeking sanctuary in holy places. "Thank you, but I'm fine, just passing through." Father McKenna nodded but didn't seem entirely convinced. "Well, if you change your mind, we're here every day. Sometimes talking to someone can help, even if you don't think you need it." I thanked him and walked away, but I could feel him watching me until I turned the corner and disappeared from his sight. He was a good man, the kind of priest who actually cared about his flock. I hoped he'd never have to deal with the kind of things that had destroyed his predecessor in Cinder Glen. The first postcard arrived a month later. No return address, no postmark that indicated where it had been mailed from, no routing information that would help trace its origin. Just my name written on cream-coloured cardstock in that same looping script I'd seen on the mission briefing. The postal service had delivered it to my new address, a studio apartment I'd rented under an assumed name using cash and forged documents. I'd taken precautions that should have made me impossible to track, but somehow the card had found me anyway. On the front was a photograph of a small church, generic enough to be anywhere in rural America. White painted wood, simple steeple, surrounded by overgrown grass and old trees. It could have been any of 1,000 similar buildings scattered across the countryside. On the back beneath my address was a single name, written in the same careful handwriting. Eliander Vale, and a date, this coming Sunday. I stared at the card for an hour, turning it over in my hands and looking for clues about its origin. The paper was expensive, heavier than normal postcards, with a texture that felt almost organic. The photograph was professionally printed, but there was something wrong with the colours. Too vivid in some places, too muted in others, like it had been taken with a camera that could see spectrums invisible to human eyes. More postcards followed over the months that came after. Different churches, different dates, but always the same handwriting, and always Sundays. Sometimes they arrived weekly, sometimes months would pass between them. I tried moving to different cities, changing my name legally, even burning the cards as soon as they arrived. Nothing stopped them from coming. The postal workers who delivered them treated the cards like any other mail, despite the impossibility of their origins. When I asked my current mailman, a friendly guy named Steve Rodriguez, about unusual delivery instructions or special handling, he just shrugged and said they came through the regular channels like everything else. Nothing special about them, he told me. Just regular postcards from, well, I don't know where they're from actually. No return address, no postmark. But they've got proper postage, so we deliver them. Doesn't that seem strange to you? Steve considered this for a moment, then shrugged again. Lot of strange things in this job. Mail from dead people, letters addressed to houses that don't exist, packages that weigh more empty than full. you learn not to ask too many questions. I started visiting some of the churches shown on the postcards, driving hundreds of miles to stand in parking lots and stare at buildings that looked perfectly normal in daylight. Most were active congregations with regular services and community events, potluck dinners, youth groups, charity drives for local food banks. A few were abandoned, left to decay when their populations moved to larger towns or cities in search of better opportunities. These were the ones that disturbed me most. Empty shells that still carried the weight of former faith, like abandoned houses where you could still feel the presence of previous occupants. But I never went inside any of them. Something told me that crossing those thresholds would complete whatever transaction had begun in Cinder Glen. I was being invited to join something, and the invitation would remain open as long as I stayed on the outside looking in. The government's continued involvement became clearer over time. I'd catch glimpses of familiar faces in crowds, handlers I'd worked with, support staff from the unnamed agency, even some of the other operatives I'd known by reputation, if not personally. They watched from a distance but never approached directly. At a coffee shop in Atlanta, I spotted Agent Morrison reading a newspaper at a corner table. He was one of the few handlers who'd worked with me multiple times, recognizable by his perfectly trimmed beard and the way he held his coffee cup with both hands. When our eyes met across the room, he nodded slightly but made no move to approach or acknowledge me beyond that brief recognition. In a bookstore in Denver, I saw Sarah Chen browsing the mystery section. She'd been one of their logistics coordinators responsible for arranging safe houses and transportation for field operatives. When I walked past her aisle, she was gone, but I found a business card tucked between two books where she'd been standing. No company name, just a phone number written in pencil. I never called the number, but I kept the card as a reminder that I was still being monitored. They couldn't control me anymore, but they hadn't forgotten about me either. I was a loose end they couldn't tie off, contaminated by something they understood, but couldn't control. My survival had been unexpected, but not necessarily unwelcome. I was proof that their arrangement with whatever lived in places like Cinder Glen was still functional. A living reminder that some prices were worth paying for access to power beyond human comprehension. The burn on my chest never healed properly. It ached when storms approached and throbbed during religious holidays. On Christmas morning and Easter Sunday, the pain was so intense I could barely get out of bed. Other holy days affected it less severely, but there was always some reaction. I learned to read the mark like a barometer for supernatural activity. When it started burning without obvious meteorological cause, something significant was happening somewhere in the world. A new congregation accepting an invitation they didn't understand. Another small town disappearing from maps and memory. Fresh offerings being prepared for ancient appetites that had learned to work within modern systems. The worst episode happened on Good Friday 3 years after Cinder Glen. I was living in Phoenix at the time, working construction during the day and trying to build a normal life despite the postcards that continued to arrive. The pain started around noon and built in intensity until I was writhing on my apartment floor, clawing at my chest and screaming into a pillow to muffle the sound. It lasted for 3 hours, the same amount of time I realized later that Christ was supposed to have suffered on the cross. When it finally stopped, I was weak and exhausted, but the burn mark itself was clearer than it had been in months. The handprint pattern stood out against my skin, like it had been freshly applied. That night, the local news reported that an entire congregation had vanished from a church in rural New Mexico. 73 people who'd attended Good Friday services and simply never come home. The church was found empty except for their personal belongings. Purses, car keys, cell phones, all left behind in the pews. No signs of struggle, no evidence of foul play. Just an entire community that had stepped out of existence between 3 o'clock and 6 o'clock on the holiest day of the Christian calendar. The FBI investigated for 6 months and found nothing. The case was eventually classified as a mass disappearance with unknown causes, filed away with other inexplicable events that didn't fit into normal investigative frameworks. But I knew what had happened. Another door had been opened, another transaction completed, another group of faithful souls collected by something that fed on human devotion. 5 years have passed since Deacon died in that church. 5 years of postcards and sleepless nights, and the growing certainty that Eliander Vale is still out there, still serving his master, still collecting the faithful one soul at a time. The world continues to turn, people go about their daily lives, but underneath the surface of normal reality, something vast and patient is rebuilding itself. I've started keeping a journal, documenting the patterns I've noticed. Churches that appear on postcards tend to experience unusual events within 6 months of the mailing. Disappearances, unexplained phenomena, reports of miraculous healings that turn out to be something else entirely. I've tracked 17 separate incidents across 12 states, all connected by the same thread of wrongness that led us to Cinder Glen. Sometimes I wonder if I should have stayed in that church, if running was a mistake that doomed me to something worse than a quick death. Deacon saw something beautiful in those final moments, something worth dying for. His expression of joy was genuine, untainted by fear or regret. Maybe he was the lucky one. Maybe what he experienced in those last seconds was worth the price of everything that came before. But then another postcard arrives, and I remember that some knowledge comes with a cost too high for any sane person to pay. The government knew that cost when they sent us to Cinder Glen. They knew we wouldn't be coming back the same people who had left, if we came back at all. They'd made their deal with something that existed before governments, before countries, before the idea that human beings could control their own destiny. We were just the latest payment in a transaction that'd been ongoing for centuries, possibly millennia. 2 more souls offered to something that collected devotion, like a commodity, and transformed faith into fuel for purposes we couldn't begin to understand. The latest postcard is sitting on my kitchen table as I write this. The church in the photograph is only 50 miles away, a small Methodist congregation in the Shenandoah Valley. The building looks well maintained, with fresh flowers planted around the entrance and a sign advertising Sunday services at 10 o'clock. The date written on the back is this coming Sunday, 3 days from now. Part of me wants to drive there, to finally confront whatever has been stalking me through the mail for half a decade, to demand answers about what happened to my partner and why I was allowed to survive when he wasn't, to understand what the government really gets in exchange for feeding operatives to things that shouldn't exist. But I know better now. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. Some conversations with the divine leave nothing behind but empty vessels and satisfied laughter. Some invitations are extended, not as offers, but as inevitabilities. The burn on my chest is starting to ache again. A low throb that tells me something is coming. Not just for the Methodist congregation in the Shenandoah Valley, but for me. Whatever transaction began in Cinder Glen 5 years ago isn't finished yet. I was allowed to escape so I could serve a different purpose, fulfill a different role in a plan I'm only beginning to understand. The sun is setting outside my window, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that remind me of fire. Somewhere in the distance, carried on the evening breeze that shouldn't exist in this landlocked city, I can hear church bells ringing the call to evening service. The sound is getting closer every week, more distinct, more insistent, like something calling me home to a place I've never been, but somehow remember. The postcards aren't threats or warnings, they're directions. A map leading me back to where I belong, where I was always meant to end up. I can feel it now, the pull that Deacon must have felt in those final moments. The certainty that there's something larger than individual existence, something that makes human suffering worthwhile if it serves the right purpose. It's beautiful in its simplicity, terrifying in its scope. Maybe tomorrow I'll ignore the postcard, throw it away like I have so many others. Maybe I'll keep running, keep pretending that I can build a normal life despite the supernatural brand burned into my chest. Or maybe I'll finally accept the invitation that's been extended to me for 5 years. Maybe I'll drive to that Methodist church in the Shenandoah Valley and walk through doors that will close behind me forever. The bells are ringing again, louder now, close enough that I can hear individual notes in the melody they're playing. A hymn I remember from childhood, from the brief period when one of my foster families tried to save my soul through regular church attendance. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me, always on Sunday, always calling me home.